PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Emily Sneff, author of When the Declaration of Independence Was News.
Emily Sneff is the author of When the Declaration of Independence Was News. Emily, take us back to the 1700s. What was printing culture like in the colonies at that time?
Well, it was a very different media landscape than what we are used to today. You had printers who were working primarily in the most populous towns and cities, who would put out maybe a weekly newspaper, or they would print handbills or broadsides of important documents or resolutions that were issued by governing bodies. But things were much fewer and further between than we're used to today. You would have to wait to receive news from out of town. There wasn't instantaneous information the way that we're used to. So only people in Philadelphia knew what was happening on that day in Philadelphia. The news would take days, if not weeks, to travel to other places. So when we think about a news moment like the Declaration of Independence, we have to expand that timetable a little bit and think about all the people involved in the process of printing and distributing that news, but also the time that it would have taken for news to travel from one place to the next.
Now, part of your story is Silas Deane, and I feel like if it's a movie, every few minutes we peer in on him in Paris, lonely, waiting for somebody to send him information. Who was he and what was he doing during this time period?
Silas Deane's a really interesting character because the book very much takes place in a particular 9 months of history without looking too much at what comes next. And Silas Deane's legacy is very much interpreted by his later time in the diplomatic corps, where he was kind of outcast. But at the time that I'm looking at him, he's this fresh-faced diplomat who shows up in France in July 1776. And as he's sitting there in Paris, trying to soften the ground for a connection between France and the United Colonies, because he doesn't know about the Declaration yet, the Declaration begins to spread all around him. And he becomes increasingly frustrated that he has not yet received a copy of the Declaration from Philadelphia directly. The Congress had tried to send him a copy. It was thrown overboard to prevent being intercepted by the British. And so poor Deane is sitting there for months. And with each letter that he writes back to Philadelphia, it grows angstier. And he really is a very relatable person because he's saying, you know, you've ghosted me. You have not sent me anything. Do you not trust me anymore? Do you not want to have an alliance with France? He's really becoming irate by the late fall when he finally does receive the Declaration and presents it at the court of Versailles. And even then, it's just words on a piece of paper. And he says, you know, in the gilded courts of Europe, you need something a little bit more. You need parchment. You need a seal. You need something that'll stand up to these ancient, governments. So Silas Deane is someone who I didn't expect to spend so much time kind of thinking about his psyche in 1776, but I think he, more than anyone else in the book, reflects the perilous nature of communication at this time and how people could be left completely out of the loop. And that's certainly how he feels. Of course, his load is lightened a little by the end of the book because Ben Franklin arrives in France and everything improves from there diplomatically. But from Deane's perspective, things are really challenging, and it impacts how the United States makes an appearance on the world stage.
You mentioned Deane's letters to Congress. This was, in addition to a printing culture, very much a letter-writing culture, and you referenced so many different letters during this time period. How significant was just mail service in terms of communicating information?
That's a great question. The Postal Service functioned differently than we might anticipate because we're in this transition moment from British rule to independent rule. And so there's new postal routes, new postal riders who are in the mix. but you're limited by how fast a horse or a boat can travel. So especially when we're thinking about transatlantic correspondence, I have a number of examples in the book of letters being sent without full trust that they're going to reach their destination. And there's just that understanding that you're sending a letter out into the world, whether it's to family or to a government contact or a diplomatic sort of correspondence, and it might get intercepted. It might fall into the wrong hands. So figuring out strategies for getting around that, whether it's using a pseudonymous signature or sending duplicate copies or intentionally not writing in English. There's all these different strategies at play to kind of embrace what letter culture looks like in this wartime moment in the 18th century. So there's already a sort of different kind of republic of letters, as scholars call it, but it's impacted even more significantly by the necessities of wartime and the dangers of, even if it's just private information falling into the wrong hands.
One of the key moments leading up to independence was the May 15th resolution in Congress. What was that? Why was that significant?
Yeah, the book begins with the May 15th resolution, which some scholars have called the May 10th resolution, because that's the day when the Congress agrees on the resolution itself, which calls for new representative governments in each of the colonies. And some of the colonies had already begun this process. But basically, this resolution was meant to bring all of the colonies into alignment. But the reason why I call it the May 15th resolution is because a preamble was added to the resolution itself, and that full text was issued by the Congress on May 15th. So that's the date, much like the Declaration of Independence having July 4th at the top. This resolution has May 15th at the top. And it's the preamble which really is potentially dangerous to the Continental Congress in terms of uniting the people. This resolution pushing for all of the colonies to have representative governments was unanimously agreed to. The delegates in Philadelphia figured like this was a good step for the people. But the preamble, which John Adams took credit for writing, actually is the first document issued by the Continental Congress which blames King George III for what the colonists are experiencing. And so there's a concern that this could be treated as a Declaration of Independence. And in fact, it was, both by members of the Continental Congress and people outside of doors. So that really starts the clock ticking toward a formal Declaration of Independence. And what was really interesting to me about this resolution is I think it speaks to this question of what does a Declaration of Independence look like? We take the final form of the Declaration for granted, but there were a lot of questions about what it would look like, what it would articulate, what sort of language it would use. And the May 15th resolution kind of speaks to all of those questions.
And the May 15th resolution also traveled out from Philadelphia, and we would see one of the impacts of that in Portugal, where you talk about the King of Portugal banning colonial ships from their harbors there.
Yeah.
Did he have that type of reaction to that resolution?
This was one of the most interesting unknown aspects of the history of the Declaration, which I came across actually during the pandemic when I wasn't able to go and do research anywhere. But one of the first places I went as soon as I could was Lisbon. You wouldn't think of Portuguese history being connected to the Declaration or the American Revolution. It's not typically part of the story the way that Spain or France would be. But Portugal is a centuries-old ally with Great Britain, so they're paying very close attention to the war in British North America. And at the first sign of a Declaration of Independence, they actually make this move to ban American ships from Portuguese ports. And there's a lot of diplomatic intrigue at play. The British Consul General in Lisbon had been looking for an excuse to ban rebel ships from the Portuguese ports, especially the port of Lisbon. And so he sort of coerces the Portuguese court. But the king issues an edict banning American ships, and completely coincidentally, that edict is dated July 4th. And so there's an understanding later when people find out about this edict that, it's in response to the Declaration, even though everyone knows in Lisbon, they would have no idea about the declaration on the 4th of July. But still, there's members of the European Diplomatic Corps who think, oh, Portugal must have had advanced knowledge that July 4th was going to be the day. So it just shows that there's this transatlantic impact. And Portugal is not only thinking about how to support Great Britain, but they have their own colonial conflict happening in South America. So there's a really global scope to the story of the Declaration in 1776, which has been underexplored, I think. So being able to bring in Portuguese was a way of kind of showing the reach of not even getting to the Declaration yet, but this document that precedes it.
Carry us through from the May 15th through the point at which they made the decision for independence. Mm-hmm.
So coincidentally, on May 15th in Williamsburg, Virginia, there's another resolution which was issued by the Virginia Convention, which sends new instructions to Virginia's delegates in Philadelphia. And these instructions call for the delegates to propose independence, confederation, and foreign treaties. Richard Henry Lee, on behalf of the Virginia delegation, presents these instructions on June 7th. And so that really instigates the debate in Congress. Immediately, committees are assembled to draft documents for each of these purposes, a Declaration of Independence, as well as Articles of Confederation, and a model treaty, which could be applied to different potential allies. And so these documents are being debated and drafted, but the Congress is also thinking about how do we know what the people want? And so ultimately, there's a 3-week postponement of the debate to resume on Monday, July 1st. And so during those 3 weeks, the idea was that delegates could write home to their home colonies or get updates on what the consent of the people really was, what the people wanted. Not every colonial delegation gets that information. Some of it arrives very last minute. Maryland sends their assent literally on the morning of July 2nd. New York is left without clear instructions on how to vote. And so ultimately, on July 2nd, the vote for independence carries with 12 of the colonies and New York abstaining. And then the Congress turns their attention to the draft Declaration of Independence, which had been prepared, and then they edit down by about a third and approve that text on July 4th. So that's how we get from May 15th to July 4th, and then from there, the Declaration is immediately printed and starts to spread.
And during this time period, you say in the book that Congress is paying close attention to Pennsylvania politics. Mm-hmm. Why?
Pennsylvania is a really fascinating case study for 1776 because even if you just go by a day-to-day basis, there's this transition at play from the sort of conservative Quaker elites who had been in power for a long time and would have preferred a reconciliation with Great Britain and an end to the conflict, to a more radical leadership that supports independence from Great Britain and a new form of government for Pennsylvania. There's an election on May 1st, which returns a majority conservative Pennsylvania Assembly. Within 2 weeks, it's clear that that is not what the people want. So it just shows you how quickly things were changing in Pennsylvania, in part because of the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. So there's a call for a new constitutional convention, and the election to select representatives for that convention is scheduled for July 8th. And that's the day that the Declaration is first read to the public in Pennsylvania, intentionally, because the Committee of Safety recognized it's election day, people are going to be coming out, going to central locations. We can have the Declaration read, and then all the electors can take that news back to their communities. So there's this real interplay between what's happening in the Continental Congress and what's happening in Pennsylvania politics. And ultimately, we end up with this Pennsylvania Constitution, which had some good elements, some elements that were not sustainable in the long term. But the Constitution is very much a document informed by the Declaration of Independence and also by this quick transition from a more conservative, power sector to a much more radical view and understanding of Pennsylvania's place in the colonies turned United States.
Another document that emerges during this period is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. What was significant about that?
Yeah, at the same time that the Declaration is being drafted, there's these new documents coming out of Virginia. In fact, on May 15th, the Virginia Convention not only called for the new instructions that resulted in the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation, and the Model Treaty, but that same day they call for a new constitution for Virginia and a Declaration of Rights. So that's 5 documents called for in a single day. Things are moving pretty rapidly in Virginia. But the Virginia Constitution and the Declaration of Rights are something that Thomas Jefferson, if he had had his pick, he would have wanted to work on those documents more so than the Declaration of Independence. And so the first words that he puts on paper for the Declaration are pulled from what he had already been thinking about for Virginia's documents. But at the same time, the Virginia Declaration of Rights is being drafted for real in Virginia. And so that document travels to Philadelphia, in this correspondence back and forth between the delegates and their friends in Williamsburg. So there's an awareness in the Continental Congress of this new Declaration of Rights that's coming out of Virginia, and the types of rights that are being promised to Virginians. And it certainly informs the conversation about what the Declaration of Independence should contain, and what the vision for the new United States should be.
Now, we identified the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson, but that was not always the case. He was one member of a committee charged with the drafting of the document. How did they decide who wrote what?
Well, in the book, I talk about how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the longest-lived members of the drafting committee, had shoddy memories. And so we really can't trust them. I tried as much as possible to rely on sources written in 1776. But there's pieces of the story that are missing and will probably always be missing. We don't have as many notes and proceedings of the drafting committee as we would hope for. But to the best of our knowledge, there's this 5-man committee: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert R. Livingston of New York. So there's sort of geographic representation. Jefferson was known to be an excellent writer. Adams was known to be an instigator. Franklin had this diplomatic experience and was also a printer for many years. The 3 of them had the biggest impact on the draft declaration. Jefferson was the principal author. How he got that position, it's unclear. John Adams took credit for nominating Jefferson to be the author. Jefferson thought of it differently. There's questions about, well, what if Richard Henry Lee had been in the mix? He had returned to Virginia to work on the Virginia Constitution. But however it all worked out, Jefferson was the one who put words on paper. He was also the first editor of the Declaration because he was editing his own text. And he took great pride in the Declaration and felt as though the draft done by the committee was better than the final product. So what July 1776 looked like for him was sending out copies of the draft declaration alongside the final printed version to his friends like Richard Henry Lee, and basically begging for compliments, saying, don't you agree that the draft was better than the final version? And Lee responds, yeah, you're right, they mangled it. The Congress made it worse. But Lee makes the point that the thing is what matters. The thing being independence. It almost doesn't matter what's in the Declaration itself as long as independence is achieved. And so I think, John Adams had given so many speeches in favor of independence. Ben Franklin, everyone knew where he stood. So the document really could have taken any form. It's what matters was actually declaring independence. And so I tend to talk about the Declaration as the product of the Continental Congress, because that's how it was perceived in 1776. Jefferson's authorship was not widely known until the 1790s.
Can you see significant differences between Jefferson's preferred draft and what Congress eventually approved?
There's definitely differences. There's certain phrasings that were a little wordy and were cut down. But there's also entire passages that were wholesale cut from the draft to the final document. The most widely known about today is the final grievance in the list of grievances about King George III, which basically blamed him for the colony's reliance on the transatlantic slave trade. And this was a lengthy grievance. It would have been significantly longer than any of the other grievances in the list. And there's sort of disputes about why exactly it was cut, who called for it to be cut. Jefferson remembered it being the Southern delegates who had suggested that it should be eliminated. And to be clear, it was not talking about slavery in general. It was specifically about the importation of people from Africa to be enslaved in the colonies and the king's role in that. And so I think the way that we can understand it is that that was a bridge too far, that everything else in the list could be appropriately blamed on the king, but this kind of muddied the waters. It was not so obviously the king's fault. And the king did not have as clear a hand in it the way he did in appointing judges or waging taxes or whatever the case may be in the other grievances. So ultimately, that final grievance was eliminated, but no one knew what was in the draft apart from the people in the Continental Congress and their friends and the people who Jefferson was sending drafts to. It took 30 years before the public knew what was in the draft declaration. And by that time, Jefferson was president, and the transatlantic slave trade was about to come to a formal end because the Constitution had put this sort of 30-year moratorium on banning the importation of enslaved laborers. So when the draft becomes public, it's in a totally different context. In 1776, people only knew what was in the final version, and the only names attached to it were John Hancock as president of the Continental Congress and Charles Thompson as secretary. So that's the version of the Declaration that everyone understood when it was news.
So during this period, you talk about the newness of it. Once it's approved, it now needs to be disseminated. Word of it has to go all over the world, and different groups of people need to know about it. So John Dunlap is given the responsibility of printing it for the first time. Who is he?
John Dunlap was a Northern Irish immigrant printer. His printing office was at the corner of 2nd and Market Streets in Philadelphia, so not too far from Independence Hall, where the Continental Congress was meeting. Dunlap was used to printing resolutions for the Continental Congress. He wasn't their official printer in that sense, and we don't have the receipts to show us how much he was paid or how many broadsides he printed for Congress. But we do know that he was given this responsibility of creating the first printings of the Declaration. It's possible that a member of the drafting committee or the secretary, Charles Thompson, might have gone to Dunlap's printing office to superintend things to make sure that he was printing what Congress had actually agreed to. But in any event, he creates at least a few hundred of these broadsides, poster-sized sheets with the Declaration. And these are ready by July 5th, and John Hancock immediately starts sending them out to each of the states, to George Washington and the Continental Army in New York. They try to send a copy to Silas Deane in France, does not go well. But these Dunlap broadsides are immediately traveling out of Philadelphia. They're used for the first public readings on July 8th in the greater Philadelphia area. And other printers copy from Dunlap's broadside. So there's newspaper printings beginning on Saturday, July 6th. And the Declaration was printed in every active newspaper in the United States. And then other printers create their own broadsides, whether for commercial purposes, figuring they can make some money off of it, or for official dissemination purposes in specific states like Massachusetts or Rhode Island. So Dunlap is the first, but by no means the last printer of the Declaration.
How did all these different printers change the Declaration? We tend to see it as a certain format, capitalization, use of italics, other things. How did that change people's perception of the Declaration?
Yeah, every printing of the Declaration is different. And in some cases, it's just differences in capitalizing words or not, using all caps to emphasize certain phrases. But there's also typos. There's extra words that enter the process, an a or a the in different places. And none of these would have significantly impacted the reader's experience. But they're interesting for the historian because we can trace how the Declaration spread and also how many people had their hands in the process. Because the name on the final printed product is just one person in a printing office. There would have been women, servants, apprentices, journeymen, like all of these different people involved in setting the type and actually printing the Declaration. And so we can imagine these people kind of putting their mark on it, whether they intended to or not. Sometimes there's typos where you think, I don't think that's what they intended to say, but it shows these individuals being part of the process, this very human aspect of the publication of the Declaration. When the Declaration travels to the other side of the Atlantic, printers play a very different role because there's a mediation of the text that happens in London where it is excerpted and censored and manipulated in different ways. And so there we really see printers kind of staking their claim to the Declaration, interpreting it in their own way. But in the US, it's really printed, the full text is printed everywhere it goes, and it's just slight differences in how the text is presented to the public, which give us a sense of how the printers were involved in that process.
You also talk in the book about, we have a tendency to think of copies of the Declaration as sacred. If you go to the National Archives, it's in a special case. But at that time, it was just a piece of paper. They were folding it up and including it in letters. They were using a scratch paper. Talk about that aspect of it.
Yeah, that was one of the sort of myth-busting elements of the book. If we think of the signed parchment copy of the Declaration as the Declaration, we're missing out on all of the more ephemeral printed copies that were created before that parchment even existed. That parchment wasn't called for until later in July, and signing didn't begin until August, by which time the Declaration had traveled all throughout the United States. When the Declaration is printed, either in broadside form or in newspapers, I can't tell you the number of times I've seen scratch math on the back or in the margins. And it's so, kind of disorienting for an American who grows up, treating the Declaration as this sacred text, to see it used as scrap paper. But this is wartime. This is, paper is a precious commodity. In many cases, printers were having to make difficult choices about whether to print their newspaper or to print a broadside of the Declaration. Dunlap was using a special cache of imported Dutch paper, but most other printers were using rag-made paper, which was not really meant to survive. It's kind of dingy, brownish, grayish paper. And so, people were using the Declaration as they would use any piece of paper, to write notes, to, make little additions. In some cases, people folded up the Declaration and kept it, protected. But largely, a lot of the copies that survive were more just sort of workaday documents, the same way that any resolution of the Congress would be printed and distributed. So that's not to say that people didn't care about the Declaration. It's just the way that print media functioned at this particular time. And so it's the copies of the Declaration that survive with annotations or with labels on the back or math that are, to me, the most interesting, because they have that sort of material evidence of people using that text for more than just the breaking news moment.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, another aspect of this is translating it into other languages, and the first time that happened were Pennsylvania German printers translating it into German. How did they render the Declaration in their own language?
Yeah, this is one of the things that's most surprising to people, and it's not something I realized until I started going out on the road and talking about the book in other places outside of Pennsylvania. And people are shocked to find out that the Declaration was first translated in Philadelphia into German. So it just shows how we need more education about Pennsylvania Germans, especially in 1776. But the Declaration was translated for them because they're this politically active community, not homogenous at all, but certainly interested in receiving the news the same way as their Anglophonic neighbors, whether they supported independence or not. So the Declaration was printed in the biweekly German newspaper in Philadelphia, and then it was also printed as a broadside, which suggests that there may have been public readings of the Declaration in German. The translators who worked on the Declaration, they lived in Philadelphia. They were used to printing the resolutions of the Continental Congress. Melchior Steiner and Charles Sisk, they had translated Common Sense. So they're kind of steeped in this revolutionary vocabulary of what was happening, but in German. And so their rendering of the Declaration gives you the same sort of emotional value as the Declaration in English. But you only really realize that when you compare it to how the Declaration was translated into German in European newspapers. Because there, they were treating the Declaration like any other piece of news and translating it word for word. And the translations are terrible by comparison to Steiner and Sisk and Henry Miller's translations in Philadelphia. So it just shows you that context matters, that the people who understand life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not in Europe, they're here, they're in Philadelphia, they're really paying attention to how the people need to receive that information. And also the Declaration is a piece of propaganda. So it needs to be rendered in a certain way so that the people are excited about it, or perhaps their opinions about independence are changed by it. So the translators in Philadelphia understood that very clearly. And as someone descended from Pennsylvania Germans who perhaps learned the news in German in 1776, I love those printings. They're very rare, but they're very special to show that the Declaration was a multilingual document from the very beginning.
John Adams and Abigail Adams famously had a long correspondence during much of this period. Mm-hmm. How did he communicate what was going on to her?
So at this particular moment in the summer of 1776, John Adams and Abigail Adams were keeping a pretty steady correspondence, but Abigail had not written to her husband in a few weeks. And it turned out that she had made the decision to inoculate herself and her children for smallpox. So that was the reason for her lack of correspondence, is she was trying to keep that information from her husband, knowing that he would want to be in Boston with them and would be fearful about their situation, because inoculation was not a guarantee, that you would go through the process smoothly. But Abigail understood that her husband needed to be in Philadelphia working on the new government for the United States. So John Adams, about July 4th, starts to recognize he has not heard from Abigail for a while, but he sends her the news of independence, and his letters that he writes in between when Congress agrees to declare independence and when they agree to the Declaration itself are very famous. He talks about how there's going to be all this pomp and parade, and he describes how the celebration of independence will look much the way that we understand it today, with fireworks and cheers and cannons and all of that. And then he sends her the Declaration. He probably sent her a draft version as well. There's a draft that's in his handwriting in the Massachusetts Historical Society. So she had an understanding of the process, the inner workings of the Congress at this time. But she receives these documents right after she has been inoculated with her children. And so when she writes to John Adams to tell him that she has received the news of independence, it's as an addendum to a letter where she tells him, I've been inoculated. So there's this connection between smallpox and independence that shines through in their correspondence, because they are writing back and forth so frequently. We really get a day-to-day account of her experience.
Now, it's also important for word to be spread to the Army. You mentioned the Army at that time was in New York. As the documents start to arrive, how do Army officers handle that with their men?
So one of the most important things about the immediacy of declaring independence was the Army needed to find out. And the Army at this moment, the head of the Army is in New York. So John Hancock sends probably a stack of Dunlap broadsides to George Washington in New York. And he says, tell the soldiers in whatever way you think best. So Washington on July 9th calls for all of the regiments to assemble in parade formation and hear the Declaration read aloud at 6 o'clock in the evening. So you can imagine the scene of all of these soldiers turning out in Manhattan as the sun is starting to go down and hearing the Declaration. It's not as if Washington was up on his horse reading it to the crowd. this is a time before amplification, so you would have needed to have someone come to the front of each regiment and read the declaration aloud. And then the soldiers responded with cheers. In one case, one of the regiments, the chaplain came to the front and offered a prayer. So this provided clarity for these soldiers about what they were fighting for. Now they understood, we're fighting for independence. We're not fighting for reconciliation with Great Britain with greater rights. So New York is the first, but not the last place where we have these moments of soldiers responding to the Declaration. One of my favorites is in Fort Ticonderoga. After the Declaration is read, a soldier writes that it made a little buzz, but was soon forgotten about because there was so much, else going on in the war that they had to pay attention to.
British General William Howe is also on the scene as the Declaration is being approved and disseminated. Mm-hmm. He's named a co-commissioner, a peace commissioner, to negotiate with Washington and others to try to resolve the issue. How does declaring independence complicate his situation?
Yeah, William Howe has a hard time with the news of independence, but not as hard as his brother, Richard Howe, who was a vice admiral and his co-commissioner for restoring peace. The two Howe brothers arrive in New York on either end of the Declaration. So William Howe arrives before the Declaration, and Richard Howe arrives after. And when William Howe finds out about it, he writes back to London, and he really buries the lead in his letter. He just barely mentions that the Congress have declared independence because he knows that it can't change anything. They can't acknowledge independence on the British side. They have to continue to push for peace on the king's terms, which is through reconciliation, not recognition of the independent United States. So William Howe is kind of struggling with the news. And then Richard Howe shows up. And he firmly believes that if he had arrived in New York sooner, he could have prevented the Declaration of Independence. Now, whether that's fair or not, who's to say? But I love the response that Ambrose Searle, who arrives with Richard Howe, writes. He talks about how the Declaration is just this horrible document and that it's the worst resolution he's ever read, and that the Congress even deign themselves to rely on divine providence, as if providence would actually support their efforts. So there's this real sense of the British forces arriving in New York, preparing for a battle, and then being sort of crestfallen by the news of independence. But they have to proceed as they had been instructed. They can't acknowledge George Washington as the head of the Continental Army. They write a letter to him addressed George Washington Esquire, and his officers literally say, "There is no George Washington Esquire." So there's this sort of communication breakdown that happens around the Declaration because it's something that is really, important for the Continental Army side of things, but can't change anything for the British side of things. So I talk about New York as being this liminal space in July and August 1776, where the authority and understanding of independence is constantly changing, and the Howes are right at the center of that.
Now, another group of people that are receiving this news of independence are Native American groups. Mm-hmm. And so you write about a conference taking place in Massachusetts at the time. Who were the Native Americans involved in that, and how did they receive the news of independence?
There's this treaty meeting that happens between the Wolastoqiyik and Micmac nations, which are up in New Brunswick and Maine today. Chiefs had come down to Boston hoping to meet with George Washington. Didn't know that he had moved on to New York, didn't know that Boston was basically under smallpox quarantine. So they convene with the Massachusetts government in Watertown on the other side of the river. And in the middle of their treaty meeting, the Declaration arrives. And it's this moment of translation where I wish we had more evidence because according to the treaty minutes, the Declaration was translated into French for the chiefs who knew that language and could further translate into Algonquian languages. Now, we don't know how much of the Declaration was translated, if it was the full text. If so, how was the phrase "merciless Indian savages" translated for this indigenous audience? But at the very least, the last paragraph of the Declaration would have been translated because it ends up in the first paragraph of the resulting Treaty of Watertown. But after the Declaration is translated, one of the Wolastoqey chiefs, Ambrose Bear, responds, "We like it well." Again, this is according to the treaty minutes. We don't know for sure that those were his words. But those 4 words, "we like it well," mark the first formal acknowledgement of the independent United States by a foreign power. And it happens within 2 weeks of July 4th. And it happens on this side of the Atlantic, not in France, not from a European power. It's just such an important reminder of the indigenous allies that the United States relied on at this moment where independence was not totally certain. It was words on paper, but the Continental Army had to win the war, and the United States had to make their own way in the world. And the way that the Declaration is received is that the colonies now form a chain of United States which extends up to the Wolastoqey and Micmac nations. That's how the treaty sort of proceedings go after the news arrives. So it's this incredible moment of coincidence of the Declaration happening to arrive, quick thinking by the Massachusetts representatives who have to present this news, and then response by the Wolastoqey and Micmac chiefs. And 3 of the Micmac chiefs actually offer to jump out of their seats and they offer to go to New York immediately to fight alongside George Washington. So it's an important counter to this slur against Native Americans in the text of the Declaration itself, that they were the first to acknowledge the Declaration.
Another meeting taking place around the same time was in New York. Philip Schuyler is planning a meeting with representatives of the 6 nations. Mm-hmm. How did they receive the news of independence? Yeah,
there we have a sort of different context where Schuyler was interested in keeping the 6 nations neutral, at best, getting them to ally with the United States, but certainly preventing them from allying with the British. And so neutrality was this really interesting sort of liminal space for Native nations at this moment, because they're prioritizing the needs of their people, and maybe they don't want to be caught up in this conflict. So this meeting that Philip Schuyler organizes, first of all, he's frustrated because it takes forever for the thousands of people who end up coming to the meeting to actually arrive at German Flats. But then when he presents the news of independence, I think he's hoping for an acknowledgement the way that we see in Watertown. Instead, what he gets is a confirmation of neutrality, but the way that the communication happens is slightly different here, because the 6 nations actually, there's a presentation of wampum belts, which signifies acknowledgement of independence. There's this understanding that, yes, we know that you are now the independent United States, and we're presenting you a wampum belt to show that we understand that. And so that's a different way of, kind of confirming the news. It's not words on paper, it's beads on a belt. And so just a reminder of how there were still different forms of communication at this moment. We think about the printing press as the sort of arbiter of communication, but there's handwritten copies of the Declaration, and there's wampum belts acknowledging independence as well.
Now, there was George Washington was guarded by his lifeguards during as his own security detail, but one of the members there would eventually be caught attempting some type of plot. What happened?
Yeah. When you really zoom in on 1776, you start to see connections between all these different events that tend to be treated in their own sort of spheres. And so for me, the Hickey plot was something that emerged as being completely intertwined with the news of independence. Thomas Hickey was one of George Washington's lifeguards. These are soldiers who Washington had extremely high standards for in terms of appearance and demeanor. And Thomas Hickey had been accused of counterfeiting, and ultimately what's revealed is that he was part of a plot that when the British forces reached New York, they would basically assassinate Washington and his officers, blow up the powder kegs, create this sort of kind of tear the Continental Army's rug out from under them and ensure a British victory. And so Hickey is tried and then hanged for this. And he's hanged on June 28th, the day that the draft Declaration of Independence is presented to the rest of the Congress in Philadelphia. So there's this caution about how people might be plotting against Washington, the Continental Army, the Continental Congress. that we can't necessarily trust the people around us. And this sort of conspiratorial notion, I think, ties in completely with the Declaration, because when the Declaration begins to spread, it starts to out people who had been able to kind of conceal their own personal politics for a while. There's sheriffs of the Declaration who are asked to read the Declaration aloud, who refuse to do so. And then they're suddenly, kind of blamed as loyalists. There's other Anglican ministers who have to reckon with the Declaration as something that they don't necessarily want to be involved in. So this idea of, can we really trust the people around us, spreads from the Hickey plot to all sorts of other contexts. It also creates this moment where people are really feel really fortunate to have George Washington. This idea that he could have been taken out, and instead he continues to lead the Continental Army, really endears him to the Continental Congress and to other people throughout the United States. So it's this small moment, relatively speaking, in terms of the Revolutionary War, but really critical within the context of independence.
They mentioned the Anglican clergy, and the Book of Common Prayer includes prayers for the king, and that was a common part of their services. How did they handle the new situation?
This was actually the last chapter I wrote for the book, because I started looking at the records of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and realized that it's this treasure trove of documents of ministers in all different places reacting to the Declaration. I already knew about some ministers, Jacob Duché in Philadelphia, the rector of Christ Church. He's the first rector to really have to reckon with the Declaration. And there's a meeting of the vestry on July 4th to figure out, can we continue to pray for the king or not? There's a minister in Massachusetts, Jacob Bailey, who refused to read the Declaration aloud and was called before the local committee because of that. But then I found out about all these other ministers in all these different places. And what's fascinating is they had sworn an oath at their ordination to King George III as the head of the Church of England. So it's not just a political decision for them, it's a moral decision, it's a spiritual decision. And the Book of Common Prayer, the liturgy of the Church of England, has these prayers for the king and the royal family, and specifically for the king to defeat his enemies, which is a challenging prayer during the Revolutionary War. So what I found was that ministers pursued a couple of different paths. In some cases, they were defiant. They continued to pray for the king until they were forced to stop. In other cases, sometimes after threats of violence, including from their own congregations, they made the decision to close their churches. And then there's this third path where ministers changed the Book of Common Prayer, and they really didn't know how that would impact their own spiritual future, because they had sworn, at their ordination that they would never change the Book of Common Prayer. And there's no clear guidance on, should they replace the prayers with prayers for the Continental Congress or for the state governments, or should they eliminate them entirely? So all these ministers were writing back to London, kind of hoping to find out, what should we do? They get no response. And so they each are making a decision based on their own context. And it's just a fascinating look at a group of people who, in some cases, they support independence, but they also don't know for sure that it's going to be a permanent change. And they're unwilling, in some cases, to make a permanent change to the liturgy for what might end up being a temporary political moment.
Another key printer in disseminating the Declaration is Mary Catherine Goddard.
Yes.
Who is she, and what's significant about her printings?
Mary Catherine Goddard is a really fascinating printer. We don't think of women as being the printer with their name on the final product, but there were a number of female printers in the 18th century, typically wives who took over for their husbands' businesses after they had passed away. Goddard never married, and she had this sort of ne'er-do-well brother who would start up something and then abandon it to move on to something else. And through that process, she learns the printing trade. She and her mother help out her brother in his printing business, and then kind of she forges her own path in Baltimore. So she becomes a printer as well as the postmaster in Baltimore. And she first printed the Declaration in her Baltimore newspaper in July 1776. And I love it because she includes this little message above the Declaration saying that the 13 colonies have declared independence. And she uses every piece of special type in her type box to call readers' attention to that. So she had printed the Declaration before, but then when the Continental Congress evacuates Philadelphia in December 1776, fearing a British attack, they come to Baltimore. She's the postmaster, she's handling all their mail, and she's entrusted with this task of printing the first copies of the Declaration with the names of the men who had signed the parchment copy by that time. And these copies were intended to be sent out to each of the states to form the foundation of their state archives. So for me, Goddard's printing marks the end of the time period when the Declaration was news and the beginning of the time when it becomes sort of archival treasure, behind glass in a museum. So Goddard took this assignment very seriously. She creates a beautiful broadsides. She uses, again, kind of infusing her own sensibility. She uses all caps for different phrases than she had in the summer of 1776. She emphasizes the references to the Creator and divine providence. And she creates these broadsides with her full name at the bottom. She typically printed under her initials M.K. Goddard, and you wouldn't necessarily know that that was a female printer. But on these broadsides, she prints her full name at a time when it's still not entirely certain that independence is going to work out. So while the signers of the Declaration were pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, by putting her name alongside them, she's kind of pledging the same thing. And she's just an incredible example of a female entrepreneur, someone who is dedicated to her craft. And these copies of the Declaration, by and large, still survive in state archives.
Now, another group of people to consider are residents of all the other colonies that did not rebel. The 13 North American colonies were just a small part of the British Empire at that time. So you had colonies in the Caribbean, Canada, and there was Ireland as well. How was the Declaration received in these different places?
I wish we had more material evidence. I think we can make assumptions about how people in the British Caribbean or in Canada would have felt about the Declaration. But we don't have as many copies of the text created in those places as you would imagine. In Canada, it seems as though at least one of the governors there made the decision that the Declaration should not be printed. And news of that makes its way back to the United States and sort of causes a kerfuffle. But in these other places where at this time the Articles of Confederation are open to other colonies joining in, you can imagine how the Declaration was kind of a statement. It was a line in the sand, but it also didn't necessarily reflect all of the experiences of the other British colonies. Canada becomes a place where people who don't agree with independence escape to as part of what we think of as a loyalist diaspora. But then in places like Ireland, we see a sort of common sensibility when it comes to the Declaration. When the Declaration's printed there, there's positive commentary about it, as opposed to the more negative commentary that we see coming out of London. There's a sort of understanding that this was inevitable, that the Declaration was well written, and you can see how it informs the long-term fight for Irish independence. So the Declaration has its place in this sort of wider British Empire, but I wish we had more particular copies created in places like Jamaica and Bermuda to really understand how people felt about it on the ground.
So as all the things that we've been talking about were going on and all these different groups of people were finding out about the Declaration of Independence, poor Silas Deane was in Paris. What happens to him? Does he eventually figure out what's going on, and what does he do after that?
Yeah, eventually Silas Deane figures out that the colonies have declared independence and they just haven't told him about it yet. And he correctly anticipates that the Congress must have tried to send him a copy of the Declaration and it just never arrived. But he finds it hard to communicate that to the French court because they're seeing ships coming from North America and landing in French ports every day. And so they're thinking it couldn't be on any of these other ships. Like, really? They didn't send a second copy or anything? But Dean recognizes the Declaration is being printed all over Europe. It's being translated into other languages. And so in November, he finally does receive a copy of the Declaration from Philadelphia and presents it at the court of Versailles. And he's hoping that that will cause the Comte de Vergennes, the foreign secretary for France, to be open to an alliance with the United States. But unfortunately, and perhaps because it took so long for the Declaration to be formally presented, France is unconvinced. They need to have assurances that the Continental Army can actually win the war. And so it's a really, downtrodden Dean who writes back to Philadelphia saying, I finally got the Declaration, I presented it, but it didn't work out the way that everyone had been hoping. And he makes this note that, you should have sent it on multiple ships. You should have thought ahead about the need to get this information to France as quickly as possible.
Well, we've been speaking with Emily Sneff. She is the author of When the Declaration of Independence Was News. Emily, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.